This is Stephen Nojiri, and this is another Tada Genji Tradition video. In this video, we're going to look at using a bow and arrow to perform exorcisms. Or in short, getting rid of evil spirits, casting them away, banishing them, chasing them away with a bow and arrow. So remember, all of these videos are based around the Tada Genji Tradition. And within the Tada Genji Tradition, this technique is traced back to Genji Yorimitsu. Now, other traditions do exist, and the very act of using bow and arrow to banish evil spirits goes back to the early days of the Japanese Empire. For example, in the Jingunden tradition overall, it starts around the time of Emperor Jimmu, or Jimmu Tenno, Amaterasu Okami, etc., etc. Now, another important thing in the Jingunden and the Tada Genji, etc., is that Amaterasu Okami is oftentimes shown with a bow and arrow. Now, many times when you see her in, different pictures and statues, you will oftentimes see a very peaceful version. But the Amaterasu Okami with a bow and arrow, with a bow and a quiver of arrows, is an image from the Jingunden. It is a more Bushi-based version of a way of envisioning her. So, from Amaterasu Okami to Emperor Jimmu, the idea of the bow and arrow being the divine weapon comes in the form of the Jingunden tradition and in the form of just Shinto ritual, this idea of using bow and arrow to banish evil spirits. Now, once that's already established, we then get the Tada Genji tradition, which honestly starts with Tada Manju or Genji Mitsunaka, but the majority of the focus is on the tradition as it was performed and sort of codified, if you will, by Genji Yorimitsu, his son. So, again, remember, Tada Genji tradition starts with Tada Manju, aka Genji Mitsunaka. His son, Genji Yorimitsu, is sort of remembered as being an excellent warrior and very famous demon hunter. He has a particular way of using the bow and arrow to banish evil spirits. That is where the Tada Genji tradition comes from. But it's important to understand that there's the Tada Genji version coming from Genji Yorimitsu, and that there are other versions of doing this. So, but they're all very familiar. And for this video, we're going to look at Tada Genji, and we're going to look at Tachibana. So the Tada Genji tradition, that tradition that is the tradition of Genji Yorimitsu, is a blend of Buddhism and Shinto. And to be honest, it also has a lot of Taoism in it as well. But predominantly Buddhism and Shinto. The Tachibana tradition, though, is much more Shinto, but it still retains some of the Buddhism. Now, the Tada Genji tradition gives rise to the Ogasawara version, which then gives rise to a more dispersed collection of traditions, which then in turn give rise to the current or the modern day version. But it's very important to note that the modern day version is Shinto only. This is because the sort of ripping apart of Shinto and Buddhism after the Meiji Restoration, some of you may know, the government made forcefully separating Shinto and Buddhism. And that is why in the current day, when you see if this ceremony is ever performed, it is performed by Shinto priest, and they do a Shinto only version. So you can see the transition of the teachings in the time period. When you study the documents, you can see how it starts off a very Buddhist and Shinto Taoist practice, and then over time the Buddhism and the Shinto do sort of become a little bit more not separated from each other, but more emphasized. Like Tada Genji emphasizes Buddhism, Tachibana emphasizes the Shinto. But then when you get into after the restoration and the ripping apart of Shinto and Buddhism, you then get the modern day version. This is done is Shinto only, and the Buddhism's been taken out of it. Now let me take a step back and be very clear about something. When I mentioned the Ogasawara tradition coming from Tada Genji, I am not saying that the Ogasawara tradition is a Tada Genji tradition. So let me clarify. The Ogasawara are Sewa Genji, but there is a connection that comes about the time when they become archery masters and instructors to Genji Yoritomo, the shogun, right? So at this time, Genji Yoritomo has an affinity for Tada Genji things. Remember, Genji Yoritomo is the one who actually strips the Tada estate from the Tada family because he wants to be the owner, the holder of the Tada estates. Um, the Ogasawara also studied a document called Kinetsushu, which is a Tada Genji document. However, that having been said, there's like 45 different versions of the Kinetsushu. So it's difficult to know which version that they studied because we know that in the later years, like the 1500s and the 1600s, the Ogasawara are transmitting a document that they call Kinetsushu, but it's clearly been altered by them. Like they've gone through and they've changed a lot of the crest and the colorations and some of the designs to represent their clan. So it it is believed that they studied the original Tada Genji version, but it's difficult to prove because they're not transmitting the original version, they're transmitting their own version. But they're still calling it Kinetsushu, and it's very similar in many ways to the original Tada Genji document, which again, what is the original Tada Genji document? It's very difficult because there's like 45 versions of this document floating around. That having been said though, in the Ogasawara's documents, you see things that are also from the Tada Genji teachings. So there is a connection there. So the connection is of material. Some of the material is the same. There is an obvious overlap. But I wanted to be very clear, the Ogasawara are not Tada Genji, they are Seiwa Genji, but they do have some of the same teachings because there are historical overlaps. So in this video, we will look at some general points. First and foremost, let's discuss the type of arrow. So you have arrows with shide, which is these white zigzags, which some of you are very familiar with and some of you may not be. But in Shinto, you have something called shide, which is used. Again, I put zigzags. I'm sure everyone listening to this video has at some point seen the white zigzags of Shinto, the shide. Um, and if you have not, then just when you should take a moment to go Google it. Type Shinto and shide, and you'll see it, and you'll go, "Oh, that I know what that is. I've seen that before." Okay, in some traditions, the arrow is decorated with shide and different spells. It may or may not have an arrowhead. Usually, if the arrow is decorated with spells and shide, it will not have an arrowhead. Usually. Then you have another version where the arrow has the whistling head. And that arrow then will either have an arrowhead or will not have an arrowhead. So in the teachings, the type of arrow in the Tada Genji teachings, um, well, actually within all of them. So within the Tachibana, within the Tada, there's all kinds of teachings about the color of the arrowhead, the color of the feathers, what corresponds to what, etc., 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 things like that. Another thing is that, so the type of arrow, right? Another thing is altars, tables with offerings. Some versions, it's very simple. There's like one table with offerings. Some have multiple tables with multiple offerings. That it can get, and then in the Tada Genji version, again, it's very Buddhist. In the Tachibana tradition, it's very Shinto. There's also various mats and special footwork. How you actually step during the ceremony actually is a factor as well. So let's take a moment to look at these poor drawings. For those of you that sat through the castle video, you saw some of my horrible drawings. In my defense though, I did add some good drawings later, but this video unfortunately just has my very poor Windows Paint drawings. So you'll see, for example, the top arrow, that's a shide, the zigzags, and then there's no point. There's no arrowhead. and then the whistle arrows. So the actual arrowhead that whistles is the sort of nickname for it is a toad. And it's basically because of the shape and where the holes are to let the wind through is resembles a toad, like the eyes of a toad. So this is called a toad or the toad eyes arrowhead. Anyway, that is the whistling arrowhead. It's usually colored red, and it either has a arrowhead, a point, or it doesn't have a point. So sometimes they're blunt ended, sometimes they can have an arrowhead. And there's an entire body of teachings related to how to make them with an arrowhead and how to make them without an arrowhead, and when to add an arrowhead and when not to, and if you use this arrowhead it has to have this color feathers, and if it does, etc., etc., etc. So there's a lot of ritualism around how to build the arrow and what the arrow looks like. But these are the three types of arrows that you will see in almost any bow exorcism, is either a blunt shide tipped one or a whistling arrow that may or may not have a head on it. All right, so the other thing to look at is the four direction pattern, or the patterning. So in this diagram, I'm going to just give you the example of the four direction patterning. So in the middle, you see the yellow and the brown, that's a bow and an arrow. And then the white circles are actual targets, or maybe there's not targets, it's just the general area where you're shooting. But basically, four direction pattern, you shoot off into the different directions. Now, there's some discrepancy. Some say you shoot off the edge, off the corners, and then some say you would shoot directly off of the side. In this diagram, the shooting is taking place off of the corners. But if it's a tradition that says don't shoot off the corners, shoot perpendicular to the mat, right? So you would have to check whichever tradition you're looking at would be the one to basically tell you, are you shooting off the edges or are you shooting sort of perpendicular to the flat sides, right? So, but the reason that I put this on here is to give you an idea that, remember I mentioned earlier, there's usually a type of mat, and the mat has a certain number of sides and corners, and then the how many directions you're shooting in sort of determines the shape of the mat, the orientation of the mat, etc., etc., etc. So you have, remember, you've got the arrows, the altar, the mat, etc., etc. So this would be an example of the mat. So three directions, four directions, five directions, etc., etc. The pattern of the mat, the number of directions the arrow shot changes based on the type of evil spirit that's being banished. So the spirit type determines the number of arrows, the directions, the pattern, which god is invoked, which gods are invoked, what offerings are made, what spoken spell, what mantra, what incantation is done, and other various aspects. So there's a lot of factors to figure in. So are you a Tachibana tradition using the Shide arrow, or are you a Tada Genji using the whistling arrow? Right? Because the Tachibana tradition is the Shide, the white zigzag arrows, and the Tada Genji and Ogasawara are the whistling arrows. And so what type of arrow are you? What tradition are you following? Which arrow are you using? And then what type of spirit is it? Okay, if it's this kind of spirit, then you need to have this many directions, and you need to say it involves this deity incantation, etc., etc., etc. So there's formulas for this. There's actually documents that literally are formularies of, once you know the type of evil spirit that you're banishing, then has a direction. Oh, it's this type of evil spirit. Okay, you need this, 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 and this, and then you do the ceremony. Now, the very most simplest version is plucking the string, or praying to Hachiman and firing a whistling arrow. So if all you have is a whistling arrow and you don't have mats, you don't have any of all this, sometimes it's said that the most simplest version is with heartfelt true faith and devotion. You just sort of pluck the string of your bow, and then you pray to Hachiman, Daibo Satsu, and you then say basically like, by the power of Hachiman Daibosatsu, and I chase you away, be gone from this place, and then then release the arrow. A whistling arrow is said to take the evil spirit away with it. So there you go. That's the most simplest version. But since we're not talking about just the simplest version, we're talking about the full versions. Well, we're not going into extreme detail, but here's another detail. So this image is from the Tada Genji manual that I'm using, and it shows the placement of the feet and subsequent steps. Now this is only the opening. This is only one of many different diagrams. So if you look at this, you can say, "Oh, this is pretty simple. Oh, this is pretty straightforward." But this is only the first. Like, if you want to imagine kata, this would be like the first one, right? This is the opener. This is the basic one. This is the one that everybody that attends the first class learns this, right? So this is the opening. This is the most fundamental step for when you are stepping onto the mat. If you're using a mat that is and again, this mat is very ritual, and it has all kinds of stuff associated with it, colors and direction and everything. But when stepping onto it, you have to use this pattern. So this is the Tada Genji pattern to step onto the mat. One of them. This is the basic one. There's more listed in the document, and they're much more complex than this one. But this is the simplest, most basic one. Now, the thing to note, though, is this is very similar to Taoism and Chinese traditions, where the stepping pattern has a magical purpose. There's an actual power to the stepping pattern. Think of the Big Dipper steps, for example. That's a very sort of famous Taoist ritual where the Taoist priest will actually step a certain way in a certain foot pattern to sort of in this invocation to the Big Dipper. So this step pattern is very interesting. Now, speaking of Taoism or yin and yang type teachings, um, in this panel we will see I have white with red trimmed arrows pointing to two things that have a big white arrow pointing to another one. Now the white with red arrows, this is showing the difference in the foot pattern for male and female, right? So male energy, female energy, male, female. Um, this makes a difference. The text specifically is discussing like male foot pattern, female foot pattern. So you have another sort of yin and yang thing here, which is related to the feet. So this has a very Taoist, all of the footwork has a very Taoist feel to it, and almost certainly has a Taoist origin. Now the white arrow, the big white arrow, which covers up the middle text, so you don't get to see what's in the middle because I've covered it up with arrows. But the big white arrow is pointing over, and there you can see Buddhist seed syllables with the sort of Chinese Taoist spells. So again, being Tada Genji, there's a lot of this. It's very Buddhist and Taoist in feeling. Now we looked earlier at the different type of arrows, and we're showing the Tachibana Shinto tradition being the blunt arrow with the shide, and then the Tada Genji tradition, the very Buddhist, Taoist, Shinto, but predominantly Buddhist tradition, or Buddhist Shinto tradition with the footwork being very Taoist. So the Tachibana tradition, very Shinto with a little Buddhism. The Tada Genji tradition, very Buddhist, very Shinto, very Taoist, well mixed together. Now let's take a moment to look at the altar. So earlier in the video I said there's sort of this issue with altars. So here on your screen you can see the Tachibana style. So this is the Shinto style. So Tachibana Jingunden, Shinto style. And you can see that on the diagram to the left there are multiple tables, and each table has multiple things. Also take note that the arrows are laid side by side on the table. And then on the picture on the right you can see this is a proper Shinto altar. You see, just look at it, very that is so Shinto, right? So The altar arrangements are like this for the Tachibana Jingunden style. But now let's take a look at the Tada Genji tradition. So the Tada Genji tradition is more streamlined, and the arrows are also positioned differently. There's less Shinto and is more Buddhism and the paper spells. Again, predominantly Buddhist with the Shinto elements, but also this sort of yin and yang Taoist teachings as well. So in here, for example, it's not multiple shrines, not multiple shrines, multiple tables, multiple levels. It's one square altar, with everything positioned on it. So, and then the arrows, instead of being positioned laid on the table, the arrows are actually positioned differently as well. So again, in the end, it's still a bow and arrow exorcism, or using the bow and arrow to enact magical ritual. But again, it's interesting how it's the same ritual, but depending on the tradition, it can be so different, which is interesting as well, because remember, the Tada Genji Jingunden and the Tachibana Jingunden, in terms of the sort of the military teachings, teach very much the same thing. But when it comes to this bow and arrow exorcism, they are, again, using the bow and arrow to banish evil spirits, but how it's done and how it looks and the details are considerably different. So let's go over a little bit more before we end the video. So as mentioned earlier, the Ogasawara version and the Tada Genji version share many aspects in common. For example, they both use the whistling arrows. The Ogasawara version seems to be the origin point for many of the current post-Meiji versions of the ritual that exist. However, remember though, the current versions are devoid of Buddhism after that mandate to split the two religions apart, and they're extremely slow and extremely formal. If you guys ever see this bow and arrow exorcism take place in a modern day Shinto ritual, it is very slow, and they shoot like one time. It takes like 15 minutes for everybody to go through these very formal motions, and then like one arrow gets shot, and then it's like another 10 minutes for people to leave. It's a really slow and very formal version of the ceremony. It is Shinto. It is purely like it is Shinto only. All the Buddhism and the Taoism has been removed. The only time that you will still see some Taoism sneak in is there are certain parts where you're supposed to do kujikiri, for example. And I've seen a couple of modern day versions where they still do the kujikiri part, which is interesting. Um, anyway, so but the Tada Genji, what I'm trying to get at is the Tada Genji tradition, the tradition in the documents, the Tada Genji manuals show a very vibrant, a very fast, a very active, like a Buddhist warrior aspect rather than a Shinto priest. So when you get into the Tachibana version, it's getting more Shinto, and then definitely when you get that post-Meiji Shinto version, it's very slow, very formal. But the Tada Genji tradition is very vibrant, and it's quick and it's fast, and it's absolutely a warrior's ritual. Another huge difference is that the Tada Genji documents always refer to Hachiman Daibo Satsu, which is the clan god of the Genji, as Hachiman Daibo Satsu. But the more Shinto documents and any document after the split between Shinto and Buddhism list Hachiman as Hachiman Okami. It doesn't matter even if the document was like if we see in history like a document from 1600s or 1700s where it might say Hachiman Daibo Satsu, and then that document gets transcribed post Meiji, many times when it's transcribed, they change it from Daibosatsu to Okami. So that's a big difference that we see. But in the Tada Genji documents, unaltered Tada Genji documents, right, it is Hachiman Daibosatsu, because that is the Ujigami, the clan god of the Genji, is Hachiman Daibosatsu. Now, the same ritual may be found, so in other words, now moving on, you'll also find that the same ritual is found in both versions, right? So like I was saying, there are some, even though there's all of these different variations, you will oftentimes find the exact same ritual in the Tada Genji version and the Tachibana version, or the Tada Genji version and the Ogasawara version. But again, in the Tada Genji it will say Hachiman Bosatsu and it'll have Buddhist syllables and Taoist spells, but in the Shinto versions it will all those aspects will always have been stripped out. So that's a very quick way when you're looking at a document about bow and arrow exorcisms. Just look quickly and see if it says Hachiman Okami or if it says Hachiman Bosatsu. Look for Buddhist seed syllables. If you see Buddhist seed syllables in Hachiman Bosatsu, this is more the Tada Genji version. But if you see Hachiman Okami or you see no Buddhist seed syllables, you're probably looking at either you're looking at a version of a document that was edited post Meiji split, or it was already more aligned to Shinto before then. But that's quickly how you can get a feeling of the type of bow exorcism. And talking about things that they all agree upon, so we're going to close this video by looking at the three main deities of bow exorcism. So the bow exorcism, regardless of the tradition, all of them have these three main deities. But there will be some variation based on Buddhist versus Shinto, right? So every one of the traditions, Amaterasu Okami is there, right? Remember, this is not the gentle version of Amaterasu Okami. This is the Amaterasu Okami who is, the sun goddess, right? She is wielding a bow and arrow, right? This is the sort of the Bushi version of Amaterasu Okami, the sort of the original version of Amaterasu Okami, an archer. She is an archer. Okay. Next, you have Hachiman Daibosatsu. In every tradition, you have Hachiman. The only difference will be in the Buddhist traditions like Tada Genji, Hachiman will be called Hachiman Daibosatsu, and in the more Shinto versions, or if the document is suffering from the post-Meiji edits, it will be Hachiman Okami, but it will always be Hachiman. And then the other one, the last one, is the Kasuga Daimyojin, which if it's Tada Genji, Buddhist, Kasuga Daimyojin. If it's more Shinto or if it's suffering from the post-Meiji edits, then it would be the Kasuga deities. So it basically, Kasuga Daimyojin is the Buddhist version of the Kasuga deities, and then the Kasuga shrine deities that removed of Buddhism are just the deities of the Kasuga shrine. So these three main deities, changing slightly based on the tradition, are the same in every one of the manuals. There's a section that there's a particular block of teaching of text that is the same in the Genji tradition, the Tachibana tradition, the Ogasawara tradition, and even some of the post-Meiji transcriptions or anything that may have been written in the late 1800s. They use the same. It's like a quote for quote. There's this one section that's found in all of them, and it refers to these three main deities. The only thing that might change is whether they change Daibosatsu to Okami and whether they change Kasuga Daimyojin to the deities of the Kasuga shrine. But other than those two changes, that entire section is the same no matter what tradition you're looking at. And that is it for this video. As always, these videos are meant to be brief, and they are meant to inspire you or to give you a starting off point. The material in this video is copywritten by me, so please do not steal this material. Please do not take it. Please do not copy it. Again, I hope it inspires you. I hope that it sets you off on your own investigations and explorations, but please be respectful.